Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Keynote webinar titled Current Trends in Cannabis Science Research. This webinar is a part of the 8th Annual Cannabis Sciences Virtual Event Series. I am Melanie Chan of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the bottom left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button from the lobby within the event. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits image located at the right of your screen and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now, let's get started. I now present today's speaker, Susan J. Hewlings, Senior Vice President of Scientific Affairs at Radical Science. For a complete biography on our speaker, please find it on the left of your screen. Susan, you may now begin your presentation.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to speak today about some trends in cannabis science research. Just to give some brief background, my background, I have a PhD in nutrition, a master's in exercise physiology, and a bachelor's in nutrition, all from Florida State University. I am a registered dietitian, and I received a graduate certificate in cannabis science from the University of Vermont Medical School. I've spent the majority of my career in academia, and then for the last 10 years, I've served as a scientific consultant in the dietary supplement, medical foods, beverage foods, and cannabis space. So I've had an interest in cannabis science for quite some time. And when I first started looking into research of cannabis science, it was exciting to see all of the benefits. So it was like very efficacy based. And we were first starting to identify, I mean, it's decades back, of course, first starting to identify the benefits of cannabis. So I was very excited to be able to follow these trends over the years. And today, what I'd like to talk about, not so much dig into the nitty gritty of the research, which is still very exciting to do. And I love going, I say that the PubMed rabbit hole on various topics related to cannabis. But rather today's focus will be to just give an overview on trends in the space. And that is interesting to me because it's very reflective of cultural trends and also, of course, mirrors trends in the dietary supplement space, as I will point out along the way. We're going to talk a little bit about the minor cannabinoids, the role that they play, herbal blends, and some of the directions that I see cannabis research going in, which is interesting. And I have the good fortune to be able to consult with companies who are driving these trends. So I think one of the places I'd like to start in discussing trends makes sense, really, right? Is that we have seen a focus on long-term use from a public health perspective. We've moved away from these, decades back where it was like, it's a drug, it's bad for you, reefer madness, all that, negative stuff. And now I think the research is really looking at, okay, what are the long-term use effects, both from a benefit perspective and also are there any negative side effects? I think unfortunately, the perspective of the public perspective is often leaning more towards a negative, like, oh, well, it is a drug, so ultimately long-term, it can't be good for you. And we're starting to move that needle. But there is a need, of course, to look at long-term health perspective, not just on an individual level, but from a public health perspective. How is legalization changing public health in general? And as an example, this is from the National Academies, and this was an initiative to look at cannabis policy and impacts on public health and health equity. So over the last, several decades, we've seen such a change, and it trends have gone up and down as far as legalization goes, and it's very state-based. So we still don't have, federal legalization, especially THC. The Farm Bill, everybody's familiar with that and how that has helped to move the space forward. But there's still a lot of unknowns, and there's still a lot of discussion around THC and what that level should be. And so the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health, national academies came together and looked at assessing regulatory frameworks for the industry with an emphasis on equity and looking at strengths and weaknesses of surveillance systems for cannabis. What do we do? How do we move from this illegal drug sort of surveillance into this health, efficacy, and safety? So this report finds that there's been basically limited federal guidance to the states on protecting public health, which has led to inconsistent protection across the states. And the report overall recommends a strategy to help minimize public health harms through stronger federal leadership and a robust research agenda. So these kind of things from this perspective are very important for driving research and trends in research, because large federal public health statements like this often fuel grant funding. So I wanted to put this forward as a trend in research because hopefully it'll, will drive some of those trends. Of course, in the current environment and with all the cuts and all the uncertainties, it's hard to say what that will do. So in addition, in this National Academy reports, they highlighted several different aspects of cannabis and cannabis use that need to be addressed and should be addressed. These are things like state monopolies, restrictions and requirements for retail operations, which can vary a lot by state, as we all know, pricing, trying to keep pricing reasonable, and also addressing equity. So if we identify efficacy for this, is the pricing going to restrict access for a lot of demographics? Restrictions on cannabis impaired driving. A lot of you, if you've driven around, driven across the country, different states have different restrictions about driving under the influence and with cannabis use and what is allowed. So it can get very confusing if you're driving across the country. But oftentimes you'll see more and more billboards about that, kind of in line with like alcohol consumption. And so there's a lot of confusion on where you draw the line, especially because there's so many variations in cannabis and effects it has. Also, of course, tax strategies, which is a common discussion, restrictions on physical retail availability, what can be sold and where, and what kind of licensing or permit do you need, age restrictions. These are all issues that need to be figured out. Measures to limit youth access is part of that, of course, and product design restrictions and requirements. Serving size limits, concentrations. I mean, these are all issues that impact public health at a federal level, but they're not monitored at a federal level. So that was the overall thing from the overall focus of this report, is trying to find a way to come together federally on this issue. So again, drives research dollars, very interesting. There we go. Next, I pushed the wrong button there. Sorry about that. So there has, related to that, been a trend in long-term side effect research. So not just looking at safety from the perspective of, acute safety of cannabis use, but also looking at lifetime cannabis use associated with differences in brain function, cognitive tasks. So for example, a study was done, a cross-sectional study of 1,000 young adults that were heavy lifetime cannabis use, and they found it to be associated with lower brain activation during working memory tasks. And this association remained after removing individuals with recent cannabis use to identify the fact that it wasn't an acute thing. And these results could not be explained by differences in demographic variables, age at first cannabis use, alcohol use, nicotine use. And these findings, and this was in a study by Gowan et al. In JAMA in 2025, so very recent, these findings suggest that cannabis use could be associated with short and long-term brain function outcomes, especially during working memory tasks. Now, this is one study, but this is a study showing an example of looking at long-term side effects use, and also identifies the need for further research and that this really does need to be a key focus of research. Okay, so moving on and focusing on where the research is in terms of medical indications, I think none of this is a big surprise. We're still focusing on most of the common areas that um, we've seen cannabis being studied in the past decades. Chronic pain management remains at the forefront. So we know that cannabis, particularly THC and CBD, have been studied for decades for their analgesic properties, for neuropathic pain, fibromyalgia, and other pain disorders. Also, of course, for neurological and psychiatric disorders. And there remains increasing interest in cannabis for epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, anxiety, etc., cancer symptom relief, which is probably one of the longest term uses for cannabis and most identified culturally speaking, and of course for sleep disorders. Now, for sleep disorders, we're going to talk briefly about a study we did at Radical about sleep disorders. Many of the cannabinoids have been not just CBD, the better known ones, THC and CBD, but CBN and other cannabinoids have been studied for sleep, and lots of promising things there. So when it comes to pharmacology, what are some of the trends that we see? Well, there's some interesting studies, and there's definitely, as I've been following cannabis science for several decades, there's definitely been more research and a focus on looking at detailed understanding of the endocannabinoid system and how different cannabinoids interact with the CB1 and CB2 receptors. Very, very interesting things looking at mechanism of action. And of course, you've heard the term entourage effect or synergistic interactions among the cannabinoids and terpenes. Also, increased interest in looking at how the cannabinoids interact with other herbals, especially, and we're going to talk about that, especially because there is a trend for blends of the cannabinoids with other herbal blends. Also looking at selective targeting of the cannabinoid receptors for specific conditions. So we're moving away for just like looking at this is what cannabis does, it benefits this. We're looking more at like why and how, because that'll help us pinpoint more individualized, more targeted um, cannabis use so that it's not just everybody using the same thing, and also identifying which cannabinoids. It's not always THC and CBD that may have the benefits. So the endocannabinoid system has really helped that. I think also driving this is the idea that one size does not fit all and that different people respond differently. And one of the reasons may be the endocannabinoid system, and that we know that people have different sensitivities for CB1 and CB2. We know that, for example, people have different levels of their endogenous endocannabinoids. We know that endurance athletes have a higher endogenous endocannabinoids. Therefore, the idea that they may respond differently than a non-endurance athlete. And so these individual, very targeted studies are going to be very important for moving our understanding of the precise uses of all the different cannabinoids. So one example of studies looking at advancing the study of cannabinoids, looking at how can we help benefit healthy people. It's not always just people that have a diagnosis. So for example, this study shows looking at the effects of hemp on markers of wellness, stress, resilience, recovery, and clinical biomarkers of safety in overweight but otherwise healthy subjects. So this is a very common sort of study model that we might see in the dietary supplement space using healthy people. And what they found here was that the hemp oil that they used as the active, as the treatment, led to improved HDL levels and reduced stress, showing benefit in otherwise healthy people that are representative of the US population. And also incorporated into this is the safety parameters and safety studies. And this was done by the late Dr. Hector Lopez and associates at the Center for Applied Health Sciences, a small CRO in Ohio. So moving on from medical research, there's also increased interest in agricultural research. So as cannabis and cannabinoids become more popular for various indications and become more culturally acceptable, there is a need to increase production and to also make production safe and in many cases targeted so that the plants have a certain amount of THC, CBD, different cannabinoids, so that we can breed them appropriately for the indicated use. So studies in cannabis cultivation and product standardization have grown with the commercialization. So the trends lean towards studies in genomics and breeding of cannabis strains for very specific cannabinoid profiles, cannabis microbiome and plant health, which is really interesting and something I definitely want to dig further into. Also, research determining various extraction methods and how we can improve those. Also, how to improve shelf life, looking at edibles and how to formulate edibles. I think the big topic in edibles, of course, is consistency and dosing and how to maintain that. Also, looking at tinctures and topicals. And these are all interesting trends and will continue to grow as the demand for cannabis products, including various concentrations of cannabinoids, continues to expand along with the research. So again, everything is kind of related. Of course, as part of regularization and standardization, there is a focus on looking at quality control and dosing accuracies, as well as regulatory standards. I think one of the challenges we can all agree to is identifying dosing and trying to make it consistent and being able to rely upon uh, dosing across various products and product formulations, and also understanding from a research perspective, but then can get translated to a prescription. And also, of course, consumer confidence is that if you have this condition and you need this dosage, you can count on when it says that it has that dosage on the package or on when you buy it in a cannabis store, depending on how it's done in the state you're in, that that will be consistent, that will be true, and that you can rely on that. So dosing and standardization are key issues in the space. Also developing biomarkers for cannabis exposure and understanding exactly what those biomarkers are indicative of. Are they indicative of recent use? Is it something that, like, if you're operating a vehicle or heavy machinery, you can get tested for and those tests are reliable? Do they vary from person to person? How do we establish norms for those? What can we say is acceptable? These are all things that need to be figured out and standardized. Lab testing and contamination is huge. We all know it's been a concern for growing for some time, and the idea of controlling for pesticides, heavy metals, and mold, and how that can be standardized when the laws are by state. So how can we make sure that if we buy something in one state, we can expect the same standards in the next state? So moving forward into trends of the space and trends in research, we think of synergy. So a lot of what we've seen is combo products and combining the various cannabinoids with different products. So, for example, we've seen recently the cannabinoids combined with psilocybin and DMA for mental health treatment. That is one combination that is growing in popularity. We're going to talk a little bit about the combination of various cannabinoids with dietary supplements, including herbal blends, which is another trend and why that trend is really so popular. And of course, the combination with different cannabinoids, which kind of all these things kind of blend together and, you know, all the above and mixing them around. So one thing to keep in mind, and I place this slide here because I think it's important to remember that we aren't just talking about THC and CBD, right? And that representative of a trend in the space is the idea that I think that's becoming more known, is the idea that, hey, we have the various cannabinoids and we can use them. And sometimes that can be beneficial for helping us to get around the regulation or lack thereof that seems to be focused on THC and CBD. And so you'll see more and more of these CBG is not on this, but CBG, CBN, CBC type of products. So for example, This was a study that we did at Radical Science. We do all virtual studies there. And this was assessing sleep. And what we were looking at was a botanical blend here and the effect of that people seeking better sleep looked at multi-ingredient supplements on sleep and showed that the botanical blend of cannabinoids mixed together actually helped sleep the same as the comparator, which was melatonin. So that the cannabinoids, particularly CBN, can benefit sleep. And we'll talk more about CBN in particular. So this is another study that we did that focused on a proprietary blend from a company called FloraWorks that had CBN in it, and also showed that CBN in and of itself benefited sleep. So again, looking at the minor cannabinoids and blends has become a trend in the space. So what we found in general in these studies, just to combine them, is that formulations containing 5 milligrams of melatonin perform better than just 15 milligrams of CBD by itself. So a little bit of melatonin mixed in. And also looking at CBN, either by itself or in combination with 5 milligrams of CBC, help to improve sleep. These were some of the findings we found in our studies, but it's reflective of trends of blends. In addition to blends of the various cannabinoids, we can also see studies looking at blending the cannabinoids, CBD in particular, CBN as well, with the various terpenes that are also part of the cannabis plant and come from other sources as well. So you'll see more and more of these herbal botanical blends coming out too. And there's an important reason for that. And one of them has to do with the claims that you can make. One of the things that we've seen as a trend in the space is because federally we sort of are in this like regulatory purgatory where we don't really have a space for CBD per se. You know, is it a supplement? Where do we put it? It needs its own category. It becomes challenging to know what kind of claims, because if it's not a supplement, can we make structure function claims, etc. So one of the ways that some companies and brands have addressed that is that they have combined it with other ingredients, other terpenes, other herbal supplements that actually are supplements that fit the criteria for supplements. And then the claims can be based on those. So we can put melatonin in and we can support sleep claims on melatonin even if we have CBN or CBD in the product. So these are some of the trends. These are driving the trends because it's hard. Where do we put CBD? And then if we don't know what regulatory category it is in, how do we know what claims to make? Well, one of the things that has been done to get around that, marketing people are clever, is to combine other things we know work for the benefit that we're marketing towards. And this is just an example of the study of selected cannabis terpenoids, terpenes synergize with THC to produce increased CB1 receptor activation. So I just put this in here as an example of what I'm speaking of, is the synergy and combination. So moving forward in trends in research and talking about, where things are headed moving forward, one thing we can't ignore if we're talking about trends in the space, of course, is the use of cannabinoids. Particularly, we see it in CBD for pets and for dogs and cats. And so we see it used for indications that we're used to seeing it in humans, like pain. And pain management is probably where it showed up first. And, a lot of larger pets in particular suffer from arthritis and joint pain. So always looking for, alternatives to prescription medication, especially one of the more common ones that can sometimes cause liver problems. So looking for alternatives that are safer, and CBD is often used. Of course, dosing and and those sort of things still remain an issue in pets as well. In addition, it's been used for calming a lot of stress and anxiety in pets. And of course, they reflect us and reflect our culture, or we project on them. It's hard to say which, but nonetheless, a lot of uses and a lot of products, and probably more uses and more products in the pet space than there is research. But the research is um, definitely increasing for pets. In addition, another space where we're seeing trends and research would be for athletes, is particularly, of course, for joint health and recovery. Being able to recover is key to athletic success. Recovery is where the adaptations to training occur. And so that you'll see a lot of in sports nutrition, a lot of focus on recovery and supplements for recovery. So it's kind of natural that that's where CBD would show up first. Now, of course, the other conversation when we're talking about athletic population has to do with um, testing and limits in sports and what's legal, et cetera. So those are some issues that need to be addressed when working with athletes. But of course, most of the athletes we work with aren't necessarily competing at an international level. They're mostly what we call the active consumer that's just trying to stay fit and stay active. And that's where we see a lot of CBD products to help them, not be sore after the workout or the next day. So this is also a very trending space. And also, I think within the athlete group of sleep. Sleep is like a cultural phenomenon and it crosses all spaces. But in particular, sleep is a huge part of recovery for athletes. So that's another aspect for the athletic population. And now, as far as a huge trend in health in general, there's a huge focus on women's health. Finally, everyone is saying, listen, there's been a lack of research for forever, for all of time, in specific to women, and that there's a call to say, hey, listen, we're not going to do the research in men and then act like it just transfers over to women. Like we just, the thing is, like, you're not going to just put a pink wrapper on it and sell it to women. So there has been a call for increase in research in women, and that is also crossed into the cannabis space. And also there is a call from the consumer to have solutions for various women's health issues. Menopause has probably taken the focus culturally and looking for solutions for menopausal symptoms. But in addition, just different menstrual issues in general, whether it's cramps or PMS, but also then, conditions. There's a call for increased products in this space, and the marketing for those has really taken off. I just recently attended Expo West in Anaheim, and I was pleased to see the focus on women's health and no longer like sort of being shamed about various issues that you may have surrounding menopausal and menstrual health. And I think the cannabis space is also seeing that trend. So, for example, here's a study looking at dysmenorrhea and looking at can medicinal, it's a review paper, not a study, sorry. Can medicinal cannabis bring new hope for a collective group of women suffering in pain globally? So there's been, again, bringing to public focus how many women suffer with conditions like basically all of their lives, and looking for finally bringing that to the attention and looking for solutions. And the research is catching up, and this review paper reflects that. It's actually really interesting, and I highly recommend you take a read. This is uh, open access, so you can get it even if you don't have institutional access via a university. This is just showing some examples of products to support, several things I've been talking about. So these are menopausal supports supplements. So these are products that address menopausal symptoms, whether it be hot flashes, sleep, etc. And what you will notice about these is they are also the blends that I mentioned a few minutes ago, right? So you can see that you have in the first, you have CBD, magnesium, vitamin D, et cetera, several things. So you've got B vitamins and CBD in the second one, and moving forward on the others. So Sometimes you will have just CBD, but usually they are blends, and you can have them in different formats, which this also shows. So in addition to having capsules, you can have capsules, gels, gummies, also suppositories that are like melts. That's which is what you see on the far right. So this is just an example of product innovation. That is another thing that is rapidly increasing in the space due to the cultural demand and the research demand as well. This is in support of that. This is research showing as it's a survey, quasi-experimental, meaning it wasn't like a randomized controlled trial, but what they were looking at was a high cannabidiol suppository for menstrual-related pain and discomfort. So again, definitely a trend in the space. There's also studies ongoing looking at CBD isolate for menopausal symptoms and menstrual discomfort. Very exciting stuff. The data should be coming out momentarily. So very, very excited to play a role in that. So in conclusion, I just wanted to, again, give a broad cover of what's going on and trending in the space as we look at cannabis laws and we are evaluating how to navigate this sort of lack of regulation at the federal level, but yet increasing regulation at the state level. There's a focus on long-term public health outcomes and a need for that. Looking at the medical benefits, stays pretty strong to what we've used to seeing, except for it's expanding into focusing on the endocannabinoid system, which is going to help drive targeted and personalized use of cannabis and cannabinoids moving forward. Also, of course, agricultural advancement to kind of answer that increased use. Synergy and combination products are huge in the space right now. And women's health and pet health are just two hot topic categories. I'm sure there are others. The research is ever growing, and I'm sure more to cover in basically every day. So thank you for your time and attention. I'm very happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you, Susan, for your informative presentation. We will now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just submit a question in the Ask a Question box located at the bottom of your screen. All right, Susan, looks like we have a few questions that came in already. The first one says, you mentioned synergy regarding cannabinoids and psilocybin, MDMA, dietary supplements, and other cannabinoids. Despite the negative light that the opiate epidemic has shed upon opiates, I'm curious to know whether there have been any recent studies investigating the synergistic effects of opiates and cannabinoids, and if so, are there any insights?
That's a great question. I have to say, I haven't really focused on looking at pharmacological blends in prescription meds. I focused more on non-prescription meds when I was searching, mainly because not to negate the pharmacological combinations that you mentioned, just because it's not the space that I typically operate in. So I can't really speak and answer to that, but I think it would be for anybody who wanted to dive in. I'm glad you brought the point up because I think it's an important aspect of combinations. And I also do think that there's some legitimacy to helping when you combine with things like opioids, there's some idea that you may be able to decrease dosing and increase effectiveness so that you can have less of the dose of the medication that has the higher addictive. So the combination, the synergy may be beneficial from that perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. The next question asks, from a state policy perspective, what are your thoughts on the potential benefits and challenges of educating the public on proper cannabinoid dosing without creating liability risks for the states?
I think it's a must. I think I'm so glad you said that because I think, when you think about you know, public education, I mean, I've spent 20 plus years in higher education, so it may have a biased opinion. Anytime someone says education, I think it's very important. I think it's important that people understand safe use. right? I mean, we've done a great job with messaging around, alcohol, and you might not be a good example because, alcohol and tobacco don't really have positive effects. But still, we've done a great uh, job with public health education surrounding those. There's no reason why we couldn't do, hey, safe use. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And there's proper dosing, and also more isn't better. And you can actually, there actually are some, negative side effects, and that you have to be careful with gummies and edibles and, all these things. These are important. And I think it's going to just be like, it's going to take some time culturally. We have to get around like, hey, it's actually okay. Like kids can know about this stuff. We're not teaching kids a gateway here. Like, if we teach them responsible cannabis use, they're going to be using heroin tomorrow. Like, we have to get past some of the myths surrounding it. I think for that's probably the biggest barrier to overcome for education, but I think it's a must. How to you like the fact that, hey, this isn't benign. You can't just use THC and then go drive and operate a vehicle. But how much THC can you use, or is it all or nothing? And it took us a while to figure that out. With alcohol, I think it's going to take a while here. I think we just have to figure out, where is that safe use? And part of that goes back to what I mentioned, where we're still kind of like about dosing. We're still not real clear about it. So these are all things that we have to uncover, and public health education is an absolute must. And then I think the other thing that's important is mode of use. I don't really get into that, but mode of use is important. So if you're vaping or you're smoking, how does that impact you differently than if you are taking a capsule or you are doing an edible, etc. So I think that's an important part of this education piece too.
100%. There was a comment here that said, the lack of understanding on dosing is a real concern. Example, when an edible has a recommended dose of an eighth, are people really going to do that?
Exactly. No, I mean, you raise a good point, and there's a lot of conversation about that. And then also, there's a lot of concern surrounding edibles when it comes to like children. So if you're putting them in candy forms that kids identify with, like, oh, gummy bears, and then what happens when a kid gets them when a parent isn't around and they take too many of them, they've eaten the whole bag. Because I mean, if THC is present, we do know that there is a limit, that a safe use limit, and we don't want that exceeded, and that limit is going to be less in children. So there is a big concern in the edibles, the dosing, and then even just consistency in dosing. So if you take a batch of gummies, right? And then can you guarantee that each little 1 ounce or whatever serving size has the exact same amount of the cannabinoids? It's very hard to get them evenly distributed across the batch. So yeah, dosing is, I think, probably one of the biggest concerns when it comes to mass, use and increased availability.
Our next question asks, are you seeing more research on cannabis efficacy in treating autism and catatonia?
Autism, yes. So when I was searching, and again, I tried for this talk to keep it as broad as I possibly could. It would have been really easy to go into like different details about different areas. But yeah, I did see autism, ADHD. I think I saw more and more of that than when I first started looking into cannabis. I would say it's been about 20 years that I've been looking at the research. At first, it really focused on pain more than anything, is what you saw, like real, in anti-inflammation and pain, etc. And then stress and anxiety. I think now seeing it more specific, like you said, like autism, ADHD, very much more condition specific. So that's encouraging to see, because that's usually what happens. It's a progression of the research on anything, like where you start, they look at it more broad and then it starts being pinpoint. And the endocannabinoid, looking at how different doses and different cannabinoids and different combinations impact the endocannabinoid system, I think is helping to progress that individual condition specific research.
Thank you. The next question asks, what do you think about ethanol-based tinctures versus oil-based?
Um, I don't know that I have looked at the ethanol ones, um, to do a really fair, unbiased comparison. I think I'm more of a fan of the oil-based ones, but I don't like. I have to identify that and in full transparency, is I haven't really done a deep dive to do the comparison. But yeah, I'm personally more of a fan of the fat soluble, but you could easily change my mind, let's put it that way, and do a deep dive. So these are excellent points. And the fact that we're having discussions and that we have options for different is also, again, supports what I showed here in the progress in the space for sure.
Our next question asks, why is women's health such a strong area of focus?
Um, yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's because it's linked to the call to action, if you will, for research in women in general, and for so many health conditions, and that a lot, even specific to diseases, or you mentioned dosing, or all these things and not just for cannabis. This is like for in general, for scientific research in general. This has been a call since the 1980s at the federal level, like, hey, we do not have enough research in women's health. And when you fill out grants, a lot of you may have filled out grants, like you have to identify, if you restrict women or minorities, you have to identify why, and you have to have good reason. But it still just didn't show up that we had really good, solid research specific to women. I mean, women have different, especially when you look at the endocannabinoid system, the interactions of different hormones, et cetera. Women have different responses. We know women have different responses to alcohol, right? I mean, we have different responses to cannabis, et cetera. So why is women's health in general such a target? It's because it's been underserved for so long. I think that's the simple answer. It's been underserved for so long. And then it also aligns with cultural movements where women are no longer sitting back and saying, okay, well, I'm supposed to be embarrassed about what's going on with my physiology. I'm not supposed to talk about, my menstrual cycle. I'm not supposed to talk about menopause. I'm supposed to be ashamed of that. And I'm hoping that culturally we're moving away from that and more towards like, hey, I have symptoms here. They're specific to women. There's no research to identify. I'm just supposed to grin and bear it and gut it out. Well, no, I mean, women are speaking out. And so product development is answering that because they see an underserved market. So it's all connected, right? Because again, at the end of the day, a lot of these products evolve because they realize there's an underserved market, they can make money. But at the same time, it's because it's a need. So it's like cyclical and very connected.
Great. Thank you, Susan. The next question asks, how has personalized medicine impacted the cannabis space?
Well, I think it's driven a lot of the research. So the need and the call for the personalized medicine is part of what I talked about along the way, right? With the endocannabinoid system and understanding that one size does not fit all, and that different people respond in different ways. And I think that cannabis is a prime example of individual responses. I think we all understand that people respond very differently to that. So I think that the need for personalized dosing, personalized response, et cetera, has helped to drive a lot of this research, and then vice versa. Like it's come back and forth at the cellular level and the mechanistic level. So yeah, it's exciting times, not just for cannabis, but just different components in general, and understanding that we need to figure out, like, okay, this works for people, for women, this works for men, this works for people of this age group, this works for people of that age group, because there are different needs, both in life stage, but also physiologically. So yeah, it's exciting to see.
Great. And it looks like we have time for one last question, which asks, what do you think is driving innovation in the space with regulations unknown?
I think it's cultural demand in some ways, right? Like people are aware, like there are health benefits here, and we want access to them, right? So there's so many things surrounding it. It's the fact that, hey, prescription medicines are expensive, they're hard to access for some people, right? They're challenging, they have side effects. Here I have something that has decades of research to show its benefits, not without limitations. I mean, it's not like, oh, it's just fixes everything, the end all cure all. But I think like there is a public demand, like said, like we no longer want this criminalized. We no longer want this to be a negative thing. We want access to it within a structure, right? Within some regulations, just like we do with Supplements are regulated, despite what some people say, just like we do with over-the-counter drugs and prescription drugs. We want access to this. We don't want to be restricted. So innovation comes around. In addition, the lack of regulatory space federally and just sort of like no decision being made, that drives innovation. So people are like, hey, we can make money. We have people who want this. We know it works. You guys aren't going to give us a regulatory framework. We'll be innovative to find a way to still be legal, still be compliant, but we're going to go around it. So I think demand, regulation, research, and the idea that we've shown that it's safe and efficacious, all these things have driven innovation and kind of got us to, some of the topics I discussed here today.
Great. Thank you, Susan. On that note, do you have any final comments for audience members today?
I just want to say, thanks, because all of you are, it's been an exciting thing to watch the research and to be part of the research along the way. And your demand and your curiosity for the research is another huge thing that's driven it over the years and will continue to drive it forward and hopefully drive the regulation. So thank you all for your interest and attention.
Thank you again, Susan Hewlings, for your time today and your important research. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today as well and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 1 full year until April 16, 2026. Labrets will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.